My name is Patty. I'm the founder and executive director of Chicagoans. We've been around since 2016. Thank you. Thank you. It's a really hard road, but the good news is I don't do it alone. I'm very fortunate to have an incredible team of volunteers that I work with every single day. Shout out to Olivia here in this fabulous Dunning Gem.
Yeah.
If you follow us on social media, Olivia's the one that takes care of that. So give her props for that. We have Stephanie and Eileen working our door today. So big round of applause for them. And we have the absolutely incredible Kyle here. He's our bartender. He's our server. If you guys need something from him throughout the lecture, give him a very discreet little wave. He'll come help you out. Please make sure you tip him generously. This man is doing a lot. You guys can also slip out of the room at any time to go order from the bar. You can pop out of this door right here. The way that you came in is a giant heavy bookcase. So it's a little bit easier if you slip out of this pocket door right over here on the side. If you need to use the bathroom, you can also pop out the little pocket door on the side. There's more bathrooms downstairs, and then there's some bathrooms in the hallway, okay? Everybody feel well taken care of? All right, all set. Well, very friendly reminder, we are entirely supported by individual donations. So if you have a good time tonight, if you have learned something fantastic, if you learned something you can't wait to run home and tell your friends about, please consider making a donation to our organization. All of our events are pay what you can because we believe strongly that history should be accessible to everyone. We're here to teach everyday Chicagoans about the history of their own city. We do it because we love it, but we do have operating costs. So we definitely do appreciate your donations. There's QR codes all around the room. You can give any of my volunteers a fistful of cash, and they'll get it where it needs to go as well. Thank you guys again so much for being here. Big thanks to our hosts at the Bad Apple. And without further ado, it is my esteemed pleasure to introduce the extremely famous Adam Selzer, who you just saw wolf down a sandwich. You know he's well fed. We're going to make sure that he has a pretty full old-fashioned for the variety.
Let me see the bottom. Good.
The entirety of the lecture. So if you guys have always wanted to attend a live viewing of Drunk History, congratulations. Adam's here for you. We love to shit on Frank Lloyd Wright as an organization. It's actually the most popular topic that anyone submitted for our lecture series this year. But we gave it to Adam because he told me he was hunting around in microfilm archives. And I was like, this guy's going to have better dirt than anybody else. Adam is an incredibly talented historian, lecturer. You can find him giving walking tours all over the city. You can find him hanging out in Graceland Cemetery most days. He literally wrote the book on Graceland Cemetery. He's the preeminent H.H. Holmes scholar. And he'll blush if I give him enough laurels long enough here. So what else?
Keep them coming.
I do not
Keep those coming too. Like,
I'm going to give it over to Adam to shit on Frank Lloyd Wright for about 45 minutes. Thank you guys.
all right. I had no idea it was going to be so popular to shit on a dead guy. I don't want to just be like an inseparable skull or anything like that, but the dirt on the guy is fairly easy to find. Not that really, as architects go, I found I have a lot of architects that I have a lot worse dirt on. Wright just had a tendency to be way douchier about everything. So, all right, everybody, welcome along. I'm Adam Selzer from Mysterious Chicago Tours. This is just like a world tour for my upcoming book, which is called Graveyards of Trinity Church in St. Pass. This will be out next week through Arcadia. There are postcards set up all around over on the table by the fishbowl where all the donations go, scattered across various tables. And it took me some doing to find a way to tie this in to the story of Frank Lloyd Wright. Because this is a graveyard full of old weirdos who mostly died in the 1700s. And I'm not kidding when I say they were all a bunch of weirdos. Like the opening acknowledgments, I acknowledge Sam the Eagle from the Great Muppet Caper. Whose one line in the Great Muppet Caper is to look down at the proceedings of the Happiness Hotel and say, "You are all weirdos." Which is really the impression I got researching people who were buried in Trinity Church in St. Paul's in New York. This is kind of the follow-up to my Graceland Cemetery book, but the real follow-up will be Graceland Cemetery Volume 2, which is now in process. And actually has some more serious Frank Lloyd Wright connections, but I did find this connection here. This is one of the oldest graves in the cemetery. It's a guy by the name of Sidney Breeze, which mentions that his epitaph was made by himself. His epitaph says, "Ha, Sidney, Sidney, liest thou here? I here lie till tide is flown to its extremity." These people were fucking weird. That's his idea of a great joke, I suppose. I guess he had to be there. Sidney Breeze was a merchant in New York, apparently so well known that one of the advertisements for his mercantile shop say where it is. I assume that everybody just knew. But he was a party animal by all accounts. He also had a bullet in him at all times that he got in a duel in his younger days. Nobody remembered what the duel was about, but I assume it was something stupid. It's always something stupid. It's one of the weird things about these guys is they had so many excuses for standing 10 feet apart and shooting at each other. And it's not like in the movies where they walk 10 spaces and spin and shoot. They just stood 10 feet apart and took turns shooting at each other. Because somebody who called the other a damn rascal or something. Weirdos. So, Sidney, though, had a great grandson still living in New York by the name of James L. Breeze. Short hair, smoking wine, sure is only harmless tobacco. Now, James L. Breeze was a photographer by trade and hung out at his own art studio, hung out with all of the other artists and architects. Most famously, in 1895, he held an event that came to be known as the Pie Girl Dinner at his studio. This is a very sanitized rendition of what went on at the Pie Girl Dinner, at which several of the most noted architects in the city were seated around the table when a group of men brought out a very large pie, out of which jumped a 16-year-old girl dressed in gauze. In later accounts, there was no actual gauze. I kind of assume that it's true because these weren't 19th century architects. 1970s rock stars have nothing on 1890s architects. The only group I can think of that was wilder than 1890s architects was 1830s theater people, and that's only because many of them got killed. This is Augustus St. Gaudens and a portrait by Andrew Zorn with one of his models. He was one of the people present at the Pie Girl Dinner. He did some sculptures that you can still see around Chicago today, including the Abraham Lincoln statue and various fountains around Lincoln Park. I'm going to say the model behind him, I think, was of age, but just barely. But thankfully, she seems more into it than he does in this picture. So we'll give him a pass there. This is the pleasure dome of Benjamin Marshall, an architect who designed things like the Drake Hotel here in Chicago. His swimming pool was famous because he would loan people bathing suits without telling them that they dissolved in water. Now, usually they would shower before they got into the pool in those days, so they were probably spared further embarrassment. But the one historian who wrote a long study about his studio and party palace said you cannot imagine the things that went on in that place. But Burnham and Root, I got no dirt on Burnham and Root. Daniel Burnham famously said, "No plans, and neither spirit and big as the smallest plans." That after Root died, he hired Charles Bowler Atwood, who designed things like the Fisher Building, what is now the Museum of Science and Industry. Also a dope addict. When he died, a woman showed up claiming to be his wife, and everybody said, "Why, he can't be married. He's a well-known club man here in Chicago." Well, he can get out of the opium dens. Well, he wasn't legally married at the time. He was just also a well-known club man, which is a very loaded term at the time. Root himself, I got no bit on, the designer for Burnham and Root, but Root Jr., who did things like the Board of Trade building, said that his wife said that she was forced to flee the home because he was such a drunken and cruel fellow. Now, it's worth noting that this is the 1930s. No-fault divorce was not a thing. To get a divorce, you had to either charge infidelity or extreme cruelty in Chicago. So every now and then we have to be reminded that sometimes spouses would just agree, say whatever you want to the judge, whatever gets us out of this marriage. But by all accounts, the guy was an architect. Which, of course, brings us to Frank Lloyd Wright. This is a 1911 newspaper article where they call his love castle, known as Taliesin, his retreat up in Spring Green, Wisconsin, a menace to the morals of the community. Whereas the Spring Green newspaper noted that Wright was an insane menace. Now, how did we get to this point? We have to work a little ways backwards here. We're going to go all the way back to 1886 or 1887 when young Frank Lloyd Wright, photographed here in 1887, arrived in Chicago. This is the old Wells Street Railroad Station, right where the merchandise mart is now. This is where his train would have pulled in. Now, in his autobiography, Wright says that he showed up here in early 1887 with $7 in his pocket without telling his family where he was going, immediately spent $2 on a nice hotel room and $1 seeing a ballet. Now, that left him with only about $4 left in his pocket, and after spending a very cold night wandering around the city, after spending a cold night wandering around the city, he spent the next day going to every single architect's office saying, "Please, do you have any work for me?" Only to be told by everybody, no. Now, it's worth noting also that this is a photograph from Commodore Stephan's photography studio on 22nd down in the South Loop. This is where people like Marshall Field went to have their picture taken. This was not a cheap place. Where he would have gotten the money to have his picture taken here in 1887, if he was telling the story correctly, is anybody's guess. But the thing about Frank Lloyd Wright's autobiography is that almost none of it stands up to fact-checking. It's a very interesting read, but it is a portrait of how Frank Lloyd Wright wanted people to think of him. Not by any means what actually happened. He got away with it really for quite a while. When he first came out, nobody really had the resources to fact check him unless they wanted to go to a courthouse or wanted to actually go into a microfilm room to see if the ballet Siva was actually playing in early 1887 in Chicago. It was not. It was, in fact, playing in the fall of 1886, which is probably when he actually showed up. And most likely, the first place that he went was to the office of Joseph Lyman Silsby, who a year before had built a church for Frank Lloyd Wright's family. And Frank Lloyd Wright himself had handled the interiors of this place, probably met Joseph Lyman Silsby in the process. Now, over the course of his book, he says that he went everywhere, finally went to Silsby's office, but of course didn't tell them who he was or what his connections were, got a job entirely on his own merits. Which this is something historians do not take seriously in the slightest. Or most likely, he had already arranged things with Silsby probably already had a job waiting for him in Chicago, showed up months before he said that he did with full knowledge of his family. But he does go into great detail at that point, talking about the first other young architect that he met in Joseph Lyman Silsby's office, which is a guy named Cecil Corwin. This is Franklin Cecil Corwin in 1888. I believe they are posing for the cover of It's Just the Cult of Victorian Male Friendship magazine, which in the early 20th century became, well, we don't know for sure, Quarterly. There was recently a book out about Frank Lloyd Wright that speculated at great length without necessarily having any real evidence other than really going into word choice in the different various editions of the autobiography, suggesting that Cecil was definitely in love with Frank Lloyd Wright, but Frank might have been kind of into it too. Which is, well, the impression I've been strictly going by this picture is, yes, Cecil was definitely into this guy, and Frank and Lloyd thinking, I can get my rent paid.
Yeah.
And I ain't gonna hate it. Well, this is just wild speculation in any case, but I just love this photograph. So after a while of working for Silsby, he got a job working for Adler and Sullivan at a place called the Borden Block, which is Dearborn and Randolph, if you want to go in modern numbering. This is right down the block from the Niederlander Theater, right around the corner from the Alley of Death and Mutilation if you go on the ghost tours. The Goodman Theater would just be over to the right over here. So he started working around here. Let's scroll down a little bit. We'll talk just a bit about the people that he was working with as he described them himself. So he talked about the drafting room. He said, it's a noisy crowd. To the right, Eisendrath, apparently stupid, Jewish. Behind me to the left, Ottenheimer, Jew too. Then Isbel, Jew. Waiter, Jew undoubtedly. Several male Jewish faces. Mr. Adler himself must be a Jew. So he goes on about this at great length in the autobiography. Mostly he wants you to know that the Jews were out to get him here in Chicago, especially one guy named Ottenheimer who eventually had a knife fight with him. Now, according to the story, Ottenheimer jumped at him with a paper slicer, And Wright describes him as a heavy-bodied, short-legged, pompadoured, conceited, red-faced Jew. His face as red as turkey-cock's wattles. He says that he attacked him with a peculiar animal scream like a Japanese mad with sake. So here is the terrifying Ottenheimer. Looking like the spokesperson for some sort of salve, I think. Definitely a killer's eye right there. But the fight actually did happen. George Elmsley, who was also working in the office, went on to be an architect in his own right, and later wrote to Frank Lloyd Wright after the autobiography came out. The letter survived, and he essentially said, why did you even tell that story? That guy was half your size. And why the hell did you say, I designed the Sullivan Monument at Graceland Cemetery? I didn't design that thing. Wright had gone on a great length about how much he hated the Louis Sullivan Monument. He hated pretty much everything that he didn't design himself, after all. But telling stories like this in his autobiography about getting into knife fights with terrifying-looking Jews was probably better than telling the other stories people had of him, like the time that they took pity on him and took him out to lunch and he ordered the most expensive thing on the menu. Or the time that he came and begged after work and he, please loan me some train fare, I can't get home. Then came back 10 minutes later, can you please loan me some more money? I spent all the train fare on Japanese prints. And those were the stories that most people remembered about him at the time. Now, some of them had caught him doing bootleg houses, taking commissions off on the side that he wasn't supposed to do. So he was fired on the spot or fired after knowing about it for a year, depending on whose scholarship you go with. And Wright decided to go into business for himself. He got himself an office in the Garrick Theater building, which was right next door to the Borden block, and started taking commissions. First of which, he had a house in a river forest called the Winslow House. This is a picture of the back of it. It looks very ordinary from the front. But having gotten this first commission, the next guy came to him by the name of Nathan Moore. Nathan Moore came up to him and said, Wright, every other architect in town has been to see me knowing that I am planning to build a house, but I want you to do it. But I don't want one like you one that when you built for Mr. Winslow out in River Forest. I don't want to have to duck into alleys to hide from people on my way to the train station. Now, this completely strains the imagination, but it doesn't really pass the smell test. And this guy really turned down every other architect in town, then go to this young upstart specifically not to build one of the houses that he was known for. Now, the real reason that just about everybody who hired Wright early on did so is they were all members of the same golf club. They were all members of the Westward Ho Golf Club, but Wright had some ideas, but Wright said, man, I want you to build a house that looks like this. So I had to build this very normal Tudor-style building out in Oak Park. And Wright always said that for years, if anybody wanted to get a rise out of me, all they had to do was say that they liked the Moore House. In the 1920s, it was badly damaged. He was able to redo it. So here's how it appears today. You kind of righted it up at that point. At a certain point, he moved to the Schiller Theater building, which was over kind of right about where the CMA building is now, the big red skyscraper. Several other architects had offices in the same building, so after work, they would all hang around and criticize Chicago architecture. This is an article from the 1890s where they all just sat around talking about how Chicago architecture is terrible, because architects don't really decide for themselves most of the time what a building is going to look like. The people who are paying for it decide what it's going to look like. They all have these grand ideas, and they were all working in kind of the same style. It wouldn't be called prairie style for several decades. But people like Dwight L. Perkins, who was mentioned here, and Richard Schmidt is in here someplace. George Washington Marr was hanging around. Mr. Drummond was hanging around. Would all talk about how Chicago architecture was still going to be stuck in the past. Nothing was ever going to get better. Frank Lloyd Wright says, all that we do as architects is try to scare up commissions. We're never going to get better architecture like this. Dwight Perkins said, yes, architecture can improve someday. All we need is more socialism. Which, by elaborating, he just meant more public education. If we had more public education, people would be a lot smarter. So I'm just I'll just kind of leave that hanging in the air. You can decide for yourself. But Wright was not really a known name yet. His name would come up in the papers occasionally, but usually in a list of all these other people who were doing what Mr. Talmadge eventually called the Chicago School. and then the Chicago Suburban School. We didn't start calling it Prairie Style for quite a lot longer. But Wright started getting other commissions like the Hurtley House here at Oak Park, right across the street from the Moore House. Mr. Hurtley himself was one of Wright's best friends. He once gave a speech called Why Trust Companies Are Better Equipped Than Individuals to Act in Trust Matters. That sounds like a banger and a fucking half. But down the road, the Frank W. Thomas House, which as early as 1905, the architecture critic F.W. Fitzpatrick said that the neighbors referred to as the harem. They thought it had this sort of a Middle Eastern vibe, and he noted that this sort of thing is simply exotic. Wright's later work is far saner. Okay, good. Yeah, his later work is far saner and loses nothing in its artistic daintiness. So around this time in history, Wright had a meeting with Daniel Burnham, at least according to his autobiography. And according to the story, Burnham sat him down and said, Wright, you've got a lot of talent, but you never learned proper architecture. Proper architects go to l'École des Beaux-Arts in France and learn to do things properly the way the ancient Greeks did. That's the only way to really do beautiful architecture. So what I'd like to do is send you with all of your talent to l'École des Beaux-Arts for 3 years. I'll take care of your wife and children while you're here, and then when you're back and properly trained as an architect, I'll make you a partner in my firm. But you must give up creativity and individuality. And Wright looked at the wealth and riches promised before him, but said, give up what creativity? I never. This is a story that's been repeated many times, but the only source of it is Frank Lloyd Wright's autobiography. It reads like a bad scene in Dead Poets Society or something. I'm pretty sure that Daniel Burnham would not have made an offer quite like this, but it's like the being up on the mountain and off of the world and all you see. But what profit a man if he gains the whole world and gives up his soul, etc., etc. Maybe he would have been out of debt occasionally.
Then what about?
By this time, Wright had married and moved out to Oak Park. He had married a woman by the name of Catherine Tobin. She was 16 when they met, which at the time wouldn't have turned anybody's head. He was only a few years older himself. Eventually, they had 7 children. And were living out in a studio in Oak Park, which was right by Mr. Moore's house, right down the road from the Thomas house known as the Harem, a couple of doors down from the Hurtley house. So then, in the early 20th century, architects got into the news. This is Stanford White of McKinley and White, mainly known for New York architecture. Here in Chicago, he did Wren House. He did the Patterson McCormick Mansion here, and a few different monuments at Graceland Cemetery, the Kimball Monument, the Otto Monument, and the Palmer Parthenon. He also was really into chorus girls, including Evelyn Nesbit, who was just a chorus girl at the time. Eventually, she'd been known more as a model, the Gibson girl. When he was 15, he took her to his apartment to see his etchings. She woke up later having been drugged. Now, by all accounts, this wasn't really necessary. There was in the Opera House block in Chicago, I was just working on a guy who's at Graceland Cemetery, who ran the candy shop in the Opera House block. Partly because that gave him access to chorus girls who would do all kinds of things just for some free candy. But several years after this transpired, after Evelyn had grown up and gotten married to a guy named Harry Thaw, who was an absolute scumbag himself, she let on what had happened. Harry Thaw came up to Stanford White, the architect at Madison Square Garden, said, "You have ruined my wife," and shot him to death. Right in the middle of Madison Square Garden, the trial ended up being one of those things that was referred to as the trial of the century. One of the first things to be referred to as the trial of the century in the early 20th century. And in the process of it, they rehashed a lot of old stories about architects, like the horrible story of how white debauched girls told by Mrs. Thaw. And mentioned right here, he boasted of the Pie Girl dinner, which we mentioned earlier on. Stanford White and McKinley and White were all present at the Pie Girl dinner, which at this point was about 10 years in the past. It threatens to expose dual lives of many citizens. White orgies all reported to Thaw. So this reminded people, for one thing, that architects were party animals and pigs. And also it reminded newspapers that wild stories about architects really, really sold. Meanwhile, in the early 20th century, around the same time the trial of the century was going on, Wright took a commission and built this house for a guy by the name of Edwin Cheney. Edwin Cheney was married to a woman by the name of Mamah Cheney. Now, Mamah and Frank fell in love with each other, even though they were both married to someone else. These things happen. Then, in 1909, Frank decided to go to Europe. He had a number of commissions, had a lot of people working under him, doing a lot of the work for him, and decided to leave them to it. He and Mamah were going to go over to Europe, where he was going to promote publication of a bunch of his renderings and designs, really trying to build up his international reputation. But after word of this got out that these two people had left for Europe and left their spouses and children back behind, this was briefly front-page news. This is the Chicago Tribune, November 7th, 1909. Leave families and look to Europe. Architect Frank Lloyd Wright and Mrs. Edwin Cheney of Oak Park startle friends. Abandoned wife, loyal. Spouse victim of a vampire, she says, and will return when he can. Other's husband silent. Edwin Cheney, by every impression I've ever got, when he was like, okay. This kind of made things easier on him. He seems to have approved of the arrangement quite a bit. Now, Frank's version of events was always that they had sat down their respective spouses and said, look, we've all grown. We're all different people than we were when we got married. Mrs. Cheney and I have found something together. We were going to go to Europe for a year and see if this is real. If it is, we'll come back and get divorces. Otherwise, we will try everything we can to break ourselves up. Now, it's weird, really, that just this became news, except that newspapers had been reminded recently that people liked scandalous stories about architects. But not much. This wasn't that big of a deal. There was also, in 1909, it gave them a chance to say affinities to be forgiven. Affinities were like what we would now call your side piece. This was at quite a lot of the news. Around the same here is her death is up to me, says Clemenson. This was a guy in Rogers Park whose wife had died probably while trying to self-induce an abortion, but they found out that he had various affinities around town who had been sending him love letters, so it looked like a murder. He was eventually convicted, later on pardoned. Very big story at the time, but they were really into calling people affinities. And having Frank Lloyd Wright and Mamah Cheney go off to Europe together gave them a chance to use that word again. Although this was not really a huge deal. It was just something that was on the front page of a couple of local papers for about a day, and buried in the back of other papers. But they also gave them some other new words to use. They called this trip to Europe a spiritual hegira. This was a quest between two soulmates of a spiritual kind. When questioned about this, after he'd been gone for some time, they noted that he still signed his name in hotel registries throughout Europe as Frank Lloyd Wright and wife. They asked Catherine White about this. She said, why, do you know the fact that he signs his name on hotel registries as Frank Lloyd Wright and wife is a tribute to his sincerity and honesty. He is honest in everything he does. A moment's insincerity tortures him more than anything else in the world. I have lived my life with a strange man. Only a few of his friends are able to understand him, Mr. Hurley, Mr. Walder, and Hamlin Garden. The Hamlin Garden was a novelist. It has recently been pointed out that he has a book called Rose of Dutcher's Cooley, which is about a girl named Rose who moves to Chicago without telling her family about it and spends one long, cold night just wishing that she hadn't done it. It's been pointed out lately that Frank Lloyd Wright's account of going to Chicago in his autobiography is a lot like Hamlin Garland's novel. I haven't read it. I didn't see that many similarities. But, kind of see where they're going from. See where I'm at here. All right, so while Frank was in absentia, his office kept on working. Iron River Forest, this is the Isabel Roberts house. Isabel Roberts is someone who needs to be studied a little bit further. She is generally referred to as a bookkeeper or a secretary within the Wright office, but eventually she moved down to Florida and was an architect in her own right. She would later claim that she had pretty much designed this house by herself. It's probably true. Really, there's just not a whole lot of data out there about her. Also, Miriam Noel Griffin was operating in the place, the first woman to be licensed as an architect in Illinois. She did a lot of these watercolor paintings and designs of Frank Lloyd Wright that are really what made him famous, at least part of what made him famous. What really made him famous was going to Europe with a woman who was not his wife. If you look at the newspaper archives and the press archives, he got mentioned occasionally with this other group of young Chicago upstarts in the press, but about once or twice a year, maybe. After he went to Europe with a woman who was not his wife, mentions of him in the press absolutely skyrocket. But part of it is also because they started spreading out these paintings by Miriam Noel, later Miriam Noel Griffin, that really established his reputation. She was also an architect in her own right and did write quite a lot herself. She had an autobiography that was unpublished in her lifetime. It's only recently come up. She does talk about, she doesn't mention Frank Lloyd Wright specifically, but talking about this era, she describes that there was one guy on the scene who was a canker sore, who originated very little but spent most of his time claiming everything and swiping everything, whose vanity and malice killed the so-called Chicago movements. She probably was not talking about Drummond. But meanwhile, Frank was having a house built for himself that would be his Wisconsin retreat up in Spring Goon, Wisconsin. This is the first version of it. It caught fire a couple of times and has been rebuilt twice since. But this was the place that was called Taliesin. Now, Wright wasn't making as much money back in the States as he thought he was going to while he was gone. So when he first came back, while Mamah stayed in Berlin, everybody in the press thought, okay, well, that's that. But then at Christmas Eve in 1911, rumor had it that Frank was up at Taliesin and Mamah was up there with them. So this is a front-page headline in the Chicago Daily Inter-Ocean. Renewal of romantic Wright-Cheney affair is rumored, but denied. This would not be denied for very long. So Frank noted at the time, listen, if I had just gone to Reno and gotten a piece of paper, no one would flinch about this. But again, divorce was a lot harder to get back then. Now, no-fault divorce didn't really become common across all 50 states until the 1970s. At the time, going to Reno was just kind of a thing. Nevada had many more grounds for divorce that you could file for, but you had to live there for 6 months. In the 30s, they lowered that down to 3 months, but for a while, you would have to move there. There were all these ranches set up where you could just kind of live in bunks for 6 months to establish your residency. And then you could get a divorce on pretty much any ground that you wanted to. And credit to Frank that he didn't bother to do that or just go make up some crap about Catherine being a drunken fiend or being unfaithful herself. But that meant that if she didn't want to get a divorce, which she did not, there wasn't too much you could do about it. So once this got out in the press, people back in Spring Green, Wisconsin got word of it. And this became an everyday thing. Well, we got to talk a little bit here about the Chicago Evening American. The Chicago Evening American was an afternoon paper. The first edition would come out at noon. Thereafter, if there was a whole lot of news, there might be another edition roughly every 45 minutes or so. There would be the afternoon edition, or there would be the sporting edition, which would include the sports cores. There would be extra. There would be another extra. There would be the home edition, which was usually for outlying towns. So here we've got Mom, Perils, Right, and Affinity. Guard, Right, and an art mate from Tar Party. People in Spring Green were starting to talk about tar and feathering this guy. So this is the afternoon edition from December 26th. 27th, they start saying plan arrest of Wright and art mate. Now, by this time, Frank had already given an interview to the Chicago Tribune, and it starts out going fairly well. He just sort of explains, Mrs. Wright and I grew apart. She doesn't want to get a divorce, so I'm sort of stuck without an option. But he says, Mrs. Wright has a soul of her own. It is not for me to say what she will do. Also, he said that he would keep on providing for her and the children financially. So, okay, we're off to a good start here. But then he has to go in records. He then goes on to say, as for the general aspect of this thing, I want to say this. Laws and rules are made for the average. The ordinary man cannot live without rules to guide his conduct. It is infinitely more difficult to live without rules, but that is what the really honest, sincere, thinking man is compelled to do. And I think when a man has displayed some spiritual power, has given concrete evidence of his ability to see and to feel the higher and better things of life, we ought to go slow in deciding that he has acted badly. Wow. I really could have used some media training here. Now, meanwhile, this was all an interview given on Christmas. Mrs. Wright was having a party for her kids. Mr. Cheney, who had gotten a divorce from Mamah by then, was having a party for theirs. The kids all seemed happy. But as the as the Chicago interview was going around, it would have been published on December 26th. So September 27th, this was what was going on in Spring Green. They were planning the rest of the art mates. That afternoon, the 7th and home edition, Wright was saying, I am no woman's husband, telling his life story to the American with the eternal triangle, the man, the woman, the forgiving wife. And the first edition the next day, he didn't tell his story to the American until fairly late in the day. And at that point, he said, I have been horribly misrepresented by the press. I want to thrash some of you fellows. Once again, lacking media training. By some accounts, he was even swinging an iron bar around at the reporters. Now, misquotes happened, but then he just doubled down on the same old shit. He said, in the old days, the woman was held to be a man's vassal. Today, the law seems to be that a man is the property of the woman who marries him. I should think that some of you men might really understand. So, by the 7th edition, Sheriff Pengali is saying that they're going to be arresting him by night. This is December 28th. They've got the first photograph of the Love Castle to be published in Chicago up here. It says in this article, it became known today that Wright, the spiritual communionist, the man who had somewhat bizarre views on the subject of marriage and the marriage relation, would resist to the utmost any attempt that would be made to drive himself and his art mate from the castle in which love is said to reign supreme. We've got this fantastic article, fantastic drawing here of the two of them going off to their love castle. The locals getting ready for tar and feathers, and Frank in his smashing smoking jacket running after reporters with a swinging an iron club. I think he's actually holding a pistol in this. He was said to have 3 or 4 pistols sitting around the place, just in case. But down below, we've got what Bill Pengali thinks. Bill Pengali had recently been elected sheriff of Iowa County in Wisconsin. Let me just make sure I'm at the right space here. Yeah. All right, so Billy Pengali, there's some fantastic quotes here. Now, this isn't how he talks in most other articles, so I kind of get the impression that he said something to piss the reporters off. So they decided to portray him as the kind of sheriff of the ones they see in like 1970s sheriffsploitation drive-in movies. Where those movies at the drive-in that were sheriffs, alligators, and boobs. Often with a voice by Pat Buttram. Okay, you ain't really bully coward for the rest of your days. I will try to do his voice like that. Because this article about him is fantastic. He said, whether there is anything wrong or not, I swan I don't know, but it's just as bad for the community's morals to have everybody suspecting something is going on as if it was going on. Mr. Wright is a nice chap, but he doesn't belong out here. He belongs in the city where there ain't nobody hurt by such goings on. Why, you know, he has 4 bathtubs in that house folks say he built for that woman. Now, what in tarnation can 2 folks want to 4 bathtubs on Saturday night? I think to say this properly, I should have worn suspenders. You have to put both your thumbs into your suspenders. Now, what in tarnation can 2 folks want to 4 bathtubs on Saturday nights? Just to go a bit in the great American timeline, this is about 6 months before Harold Hill rolled into River City, Iowa with warnings about pool tables. The reporter told the sheriff, honest, are different. Besides, these 2 are on a spiritual hegira. To which Pengali said, well, I don't care particular about how many bathtubs they got, but so long as Bill Pengali is the sheriff of Iowa County, there ain't gonna be no hegiras here. No she-hegiras either. Now, I looked for a photograph of Sheriff Pengali for obvious reasons. I did not actually find one of them, just various ads when he tried to run for sheriff again in various years. But I did find one of his son from the 1950s, which indicates he looks a lot like Biff Tannen from Back to the Future. So perhaps he was going to go up to Taliesin and say, hey, Lloyd Wright, why don't you make like a tree and get out of here? Like, anybody home, Lloyd Wright? Chicago architects, meanwhile, declared that, don't look at us. We don't like the guy either. Chicago architects declare Wright not personally popular. This was from the same period, obviously. Now, the next year, he actually would have had grounds to arrest Frank Lloyd Wright on all of this. At the time, he said that he was waiting for somebody to swear out a warrant, but until somebody did, he had nothing to act on. The next year, the Mann Act would make it illegal to take a woman across state lines for debauched or immoral purposes. This would have been enough. They could have arrested him under the Mann Act, but that wasn't quite there yet. At this point, it was reported that Wright was going down to Chicago to get a big statement that would be signed by Mr. Cheney, that would be signed by his wife, just to tell everybody this is all between consenting adults. But Catherine's views had not changed, and at this point, Wright started to get mad and said, to live a lie is worse than to violate a convention. I am living in violation of the convention and the law. I am at the mercy of newspaper commentators, but I am living the truth. I am doing honestly that which millions of Americans are doing dishonestly. I have no apologies to offer for myself or the lady who is my associate. This is kind of the same stuff he was saying to the Tribune a few days before, but he had time to parse his words out a little bit better. He then added, now, I am not a rich man. I have never heard of a rich architect. Sure. All I have in the world is what I made in my profession. I shall live truth as I see it. The life of the soul is not yet amenable to written laws. Once again, just talking like a total douchebag. Now, at this point, Mamah gave an interview of her own via telephone. She said, it seems a pity that they have sent all you fellows to this barren village to watch my movements. It really is funny. I cannot understand it at all. We are bothering no one and ask only to be left to live our lives in peace. So Franklin issued this very wordy statement, and while he kind of turned on Catherine, he said, listen, when we left, we said we were going for a year, and if we were still together in a year, you would file for a divorce. Now it's been more than a year, and you haven't. But also, Drummond and Mahoney and all these people aren't keeping me rich all by themselves. So he said, the struggle is to work and live and let live. Thus may be written the drama that is played now in countless cases behind the curtain so that honest souls may profit. And most will find it in the triumph of selfishness. And perhaps the truth ultimately reached will be found to be not much more than the selfishness of nature, when that word is stripped of the meaning under which Christianity has misused it. And now that all have ruined their hearts for dogs to peck at, may not the matter be left to the privacy of those whose concern it chiefly is? Let the dead past bury the dead. Once again, he goes in and out of making a coherent point and then getting as douchey as humanly possible about it. So obviously, the Chicago American was not fully convinced. They started having these demands of the arrest kept on going up. They had the first photograph of him published. They called the Love Castle a moral to the communities, and the Spring Green paper said that he was an insane menace. Then they wrote their own story. This is about the last of it. They showed this great drawing of Frank Lloyd Wright and Mamah with a rifle shooting at the Ten Commandments. This was their reaction to him saying that, well, Christianity has misused the word selfishness, which is very Ayn Randish. Well, selfishness is good. Even she found Frank Lloyd Wright to be kind of a dick. But there was no arrest, partly because there was no grounds, and also because it was just too damn cold. When it said that the thermometer reached 30 degrees, that's 30 degrees below. There was a blizzard. It was 30 below. Nobody was going to go clear the hell out to Taliesin just to harass him at that point, and the story just sort of died out. For the most part, the story died out. It was just, but then the only time Frank made the news again that year was later in 1912 when Daniel Burnham died. And Frank, like all the other architects, issued a statement. He said, with other younger architects who loved him, I have occasion to be grateful to Uncle Dan. If I could have agreed to the École des Beaux-Arts, he would have encouraged me much, which is a lot different than saying if I had agreed to let him pay for me to go to the École des Beaux-Arts, he would have made me a partner. He loved the beautiful and served it, but his buildings will live as architecture no longer than others of this period. I wish he had used his powers to aid in the development of an organic American architecture. He was not a creative architect, but he was a great man. This is your obituary for the guy. You have to spend your entire obituary saying he's a great man, but here's all the things that I think were wrong with him. Here's all the reasons I'm better than him. The new man, he also kept on working a few commissions in Chicago. This didn't wreck his career by any means. Some people say that it did. Really, it was just he was always in debt because he was making a lot of money but he was spending a lot more money. But this is the Emil Bach House up in Rogers Park that is still standing now, with this fantastic plaque up in front of it that says the inward present orientation of the house ensures the privacy of his residence and reflects Wright's idea of the importance of family life. For other people, maybe. For those who have not shown some high spiritual power, for the ordinary man who is subject to laws and rules. He's also working at Midway Gardens, which was down on the south side. But then 2 years later, Mamah and a couple of the children were murdered at Taliesin. One of the cooks there who had been fired, we don't really know what was going through the guy's head or anything. He had intended to kill himself as well. But he ended up setting fire to the place and murdering 7 people with a roofing axe. So this was the very day that it happened. It happened at noon the evening. The Chicago Daily News already had a space for it in their 10th edition. But it didn't make as much news as you would really think, because there was so much war stuff going on at the time. And the next day, the big front page, Japan butts in. Law cottage. It was still on the front page, but it's also, you'll notice right here, the problematic language there, which, as these headlines go, is not bad. A lot of them got quite a lot worse than this. Nearly everybody had to mention Julian Carlton, the murderer's ethnicity. Even when Mamah and the children were cremated at Graceland Cemetery, the ledger with list cause of death says killed by a Negro, which is uncharacteristic for Graceland Cemetery. I don't know who was working the ledgers that day. But then the Chicago American, which was always hungry for scandals and had covered all those things about them just moving in together, the 10th edition were extra that managed to get out just the banner headline at the top. Just kills 3 in Love House. It would eventually be the death count would be 7. By the end of the day, they were able to get in the final 10th edition. They were able to get a larger one. It's still kind of fighting for space with Germany news and sports scores on the left. But now Wright's soulmate and her little daughter and man are slain. But even the Chicago American, this got buried. This happened on these are some Saturday editions. By Monday, there was no mention of it anymore. And all of the many editions that are preserved in the microfilm reels, I went through it today trying to find anything more about this. It was basically a one-day story for people. But a few days later, the Chicago Herald, the old Record Herald, did publish this thing saying that this is the end of lawless love. Now, this is really, really on the insensitive side for them, even when we're talking about Frank Lloyd Wright. Violent and lawless loves have violent and lawless ends. An old Greek dramatist would have said that the insane servant was the instrument of the gods for avenging the violence of the decency-defying adventure. Those who believe in the moral verities still exist would find it a tragic confirmation of the truth that the wages of sin is death. Considering a lot more people than just Mamah died and that Frank did not, this is a really weird avenging guides. But Frank was now splitting his time between Taliesin, which he was rebuilding after the fire, and this house that was torn down about 10 years ago on East Cedar here in Chicago. His business had not totally fallen apart, but he was still trying to get back up to the position he was in. The kind of buildings he'd been building throughout the 1910s were starting to go out of style already. So a few months after the fact, he got a letter of sympathy from Miriam Noel. She was a sculptress who had just been living over in Paris. Eventually, she wrote a serialized autobiography that is remarkably unexamined these days. It was serialized in a Milwaukee paper. It's almost never cited anywhere. She spends a lot of time talking about how she used to know Trotsky back in Paris and knew everybody and was a famous sculptor. She was not a famous sculptor. But she wrote him a letter saying, "Aren't we alike? I just had a terrible relationship too, where I'm in a bad place, you're in a bad place, we're both really lonely." Essentially, she threw herself at him. And he was quite receptive. So she spent Christmas Eve at his place, 3 years to the day after the story about him and Mamah moving to Taliesin together had broken. The very next day, she wrote him a letter that said, "Lord of my waking dreams, I have thee, friend, who art my master. Let me crown your head with the wreath of violets like Alcibiades at the feast of Agathon. You have touched me with the edge of the far outspreading wing of your love, and I kiss your feet with my trembling lips. I am your prisoner." They were clearly already doing it. And Wright was overlooking very clear signs, not only that she was a drug addict, but also that she was a little bit imbalanced. When they're in a dark place, women who are a little bit imbalanced can seem very, very, very tempting. Um, so she was living within about 3 months. She had moved to the rebuilt Taliesin by spring, but she hated it there, probably because she knew what had happened there. And she accused him of being too distant. In one of the letters that she wrote, she said, "A small, narrow mind could suppose somebody was endeavoring to possess him because she loved him, depended on his loyalty and affection. I suppose this morning you were walking to and fro, wrapped in admiration of yourself and your house, uttering high-sounding praises on freedom, denouncing marriage, morality, and family, to the admiration of yourself and your housekeeper." So this is only a few months in. Frank was already writing that Miriam was making his life a living hell, but they were breaking up and getting back together about once a week. Eventually, there's a housekeeper by the name of Molly Breen who was fired. She thought that Miriam was a threat to her position in the household, so she leaked a bunch of these letters to the press and tried to have Wright arrested under the Mann Act for bringing her there. They brought him clearance there. He said, "Oh no, Mrs. Noel is there because she was invited by Frank's mom." So nothing arrestable here, but this went back and forth for a couple of days. One thing the Chicago American was especially good at was getting quotes from experts. In this case, it was Chicago women condemned the double code of morals for them not being arrested under the Mann Act. A representative for the Chicago Republican Women's Association criticized them for being let off the hook just for being rich, and said, as for Mrs. Noel, she is ensnared by the hypnotic spell of this man, who must be both captivating and repulsive. A woman from the Bureau of Public Welfare said, Mr. Wright and Mrs. Noel are two of the worst criminals in society. They have a code of their own, which is not the code that should govern all men and women. It is destruction, and they will reap the whirlwind. Now, come on, the worst criminals in society? That's a little bit of a stretch. Clarence King on there said, you cannot defy convention and custom and get away with it. Lenny leaked the letters to the Chicago Tribune. The Chicago Tribune and the American both published quite a few of them. By this time, they had gotten back together again. Most of the letters were giant breakup letters, but now they were back together once again, as they were all the time. But in this, they hint, one thing that we don't really have is for all of the stuff that we've got about wild and crazy architects and all of the stories about Frank Lloyd Wright being impossible to be around and a massive jerk, we don't really have too much stuff that's as bad as like the Pie Girl dinner or anything like that. But she does mention in one of her letters a hint that stuff like that might have been going on. She said, your carnivals at Taliesin are not for me. I do not want to be in them, nor do I wish to be told of them. A merry party of debauchers using your houses for purposes too shocking for words, invited for that purpose. My suffering was too intense to be described, and that doesn't matter either. Only one thing matters, that you be entertained. And there might have been worse stuff than this also, because even after the charges were all dropped, Frank was said to be living in fear that Molly Breen was about to let even worse information out, which she never did, but he kind of lived in fear of her for a while. Eventually, in the 1920s, Catherine finally agreed to a divorce. He married Miriam, then divorced her within a year. They'd been together about 7 years by then, but she had gotten even more dangerously unstable. She was known to show up in trash his apartments every now and then, or trash apartments that she thought were his, which may or may not have actually been his, and died around 1930 or so. Wright, meanwhile, was saying, why am I tied to this provincial whipping post? Why is my home at the mercy of scandalmongers? For 6 years I have been exploited and hawked upon the curb of the gutter for a penny. What has been most precious to me has been flung underfoot to gratify the man on the streets. Relax, Frank. But let's go back just a little bit to, I showed the headline, at least, of that article, Wright Insane Menace. I'll read just a bit of that to wrap things up. This is how I usually wrap up my Frank Lloyd Wright talks. This is what the Spring Green paper thinks of what's going on with Frank. It mentions that this paper believes that this escapade will give the architect more advertising than his knee panties, long hair, and other funny ways ever could. Well, folks, I can think of another guy who had long hair and some weird ideas, and he didn't always do what people thought was right. And Willie Nelson has remained consistently popular for decades. All right, thanks, everybody. Oh, that was me.